Hello, everyone. Welcome back. We are here with part two of our Bob and I series. Last week, we talked about, or at least I gave my side of the lessons that I was taught through masculinity and kind of my life and where it led me. And this week, we are going to be hearing from Bob and the messages that he received in hopes to just give our audience an inquiry or just a look at like how this has progressed and how much this has intensified um, over the years. So, with that being said, Bob, um, what was your first message of masculinity?
Well, I'm 64. I was born in 1958 in a kind of pre-feminist era. So the messages were pretty uniform. Um, I honestly can't remember, uh, where they came from. I think they came from everywhere, from parents, from teachers, from television and movies. And the messages I got weren't that much different than yours. That to be a real man, uh, which you're practicing at when you're a boy, is to be tough. It's to be physically dominant, especially in athletics. I also grew up in a culture where athletics was the focus for boys, uh, and it was competitive. Uh, there might be it doesn't matter whether you win or lose; it's how you play the game cliche. But everybody knew you had to win. Uh, and we saw that from adults who, would come to youth sports events and scream at their kids who lost. I have very clear memories of watching parents yell at kids through the glass of a hockey arena or on a football sideline. And even at that age, realizing there's something really wrong with this. Now, like you, I was really short and physically weak when I was young. Um, Small. I was short, skinny, and effeminate. Unlike you, I stayed that way pretty much forever. I couldn't bulk up. I couldn't compete. I just physically wasn't capable of it. So I could manage playing sports up until about junior high. And that point, all the other boys grew, and I was a very late developer. And in some ways, that gave me an out. Nobody expected me to be a jock. They took one look at me and it was like, well, okay. My father held on to some fantasy that I might be able to be a cross-country runner or something, that short, skinny kids could do. But I wasn't very fast either. I like to say I was equally inept at all sports. But that also meant I was in the kind of the weird kid category. Right?
Mm.
And so I escaped some of the intense pressure you probably felt growing up to perform, hockey, football, especially those contact sports. I escaped that, but I was sort of then put in this, the weird, nerdy, oddball kid category, which has problems of its own. What is common also, though, is that even if you're in that category, you still feel the pressure. Right?
Mm.
And just like you, even though I wasn't a jock, eventually, as you get into high school, I think the pressure to date and everything probably came a little later when I was younger. It wasn't quite so hypersexualized so early, but eventually, yeah, you had that pressure, uh, and and it was again competitive. If you had a good-looking girlfriend, that meant you had more status than somebody who, whose girlfriend was plain-looking, or heaven forbid, who didn't have a girlfriend,
Mm.
uh, which was really. I wasn't very good at playing that game either, but you could certainly feel the pressure. And if you didn't do it, uh, you were left out in a certain way. Um,
Yeah. I was gonna just ask you too, because in my situation, I was just constantly chasing that
mhm.
masculinity aspect. But you brought up a key point that you just kind of took a look around and were like, I'm never gonna obtain that.
Yeah.
But also what I'm hearing too is that that possibly still obviously had an effect on you because there was like that desire. So if you,
Yeah.
I mean, could you speak to a little bit
Yeah.
more to how that affected you emotionally as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So by the time I was in college, I had grown to kind of an average height. And at that point, the pressure to score with women was much more present. Um,
Mm,
I avoided the worst of that. I didn't participate in one night stands and that kind of thing. I think at some level I knew emotionally I couldn't handle it, but I still did give into that pressure eventually. Just a quick story. I ran into a woman a few years ago who I went to college with, and she was telling me things I said back then, and I I was just so embarrassed. I said, "Did I really say that?" And she said, "Yeah." And I said, "Well, I was trying to be one of the guys, and I just wasn't very good at it." And I apologized, and she laughed. She said, "Well, you were no different than everybody back then." So even the all American quarterback, you know, homecoming prom king, whatever, and the scrawny nerdy guy like me, we all were reacting to the same thing. Um, Another difference between your generation and mine is access to pornography. So when I was growing up, pornography meant magazines and movies in theaters.
mm,
Uh, and so we scrambled to get access to it. We would look for magazines, that our fathers hid. A friend of mine knew a drugstore that threw porn magazines out, and he'd go in the dumpster and find them. We snuck into the back of a pornographic movie theater in my hometown. And so those images of women being sexually subservient to men, they were very much a part of my growing up, but nothing like the intensity that you experienced in an internet age, where
yeah.
a search didn't require you to go dumpster diving or take a risk of sneaking into a movie. And those images had a profound effect on me, all negative. And I can't imagine what it's like to be, an adolescent growing up with that instant access to those images. So that is one thing that was different. The pornographic world was there, but it was less accessible.
Well, and also too, I mean, because you have studied, what pornography is today,
Yeah.
um, well, um, and also, I mean,
Yeah.
I'm sure, like, what's the main difference between the obviously the pornography that you grew up on and the what my generation, the
Yeah.
generations after me are growing up on? Because again, I mean, yes, that's a huge thing, obviously, that
Yeah.
it's much easier access, but at the same time, I would like to hear also too,
Yeah.
how intensified as well.
You're absolutely right. It's not only that people, including young people, have easier access to it. The images themselves, of course, have proliferated. You can't even count the number of pornographic images that exist in the world, but they're much more intensely cruel and degrading to women. They're more intensely racist. The pornography industry takes difference and power and turns it into a sexual charge. Most of it is about men being sexually dominant over women, but every possible scenario where somebody has more power over somebody else has been sexualized. So it's not just, seeing pictures of sex when you're young at a time before developmentally you're ready for that. It's about seeing pictures of sex presented in this routine cruelty, degradation, and at the extreme violence. And I've talked to many younger men who said, because my parents didn't talk to me about sex, because the sex education in school was inadequate, pornography is essentially what I learned, and learned, of
Mm-hmm.
course, very distorted messages about what intimacy and sexuality can be. Um, just talking about it, I'm so glad I was born in 1958, because I wonder what would have happened to me if I had been exposed to that. And the answer, of course, is all around us. It's having extremely negative effects on the development of boys and girls increasingly. That's the other big difference. When I was a kid, boys sought after pornography, but for the most part, girls didn't. And increasingly, it's uh, a problem of exposure of both boys and girls.
Yeah, and I know we want to wrap up here, but I do want to make one last point, because based off of listening to you, it sounds like you still kept at least somewhat of that effeminate part of you, because again, you weren't growing up on these horrific images. You know, am I
Yeah. The reason I'm pausing is because I feel lucky. When I was, fairly old, in my late 20s and my 30s, I met people, both feminist women and men who were feminist allies, who showed me there was another way. And that part of me that was softer and less traditionally masculine hadn't been completely obliterated yet. And so you're right, that part of me still existed. And when I saw people living a different way, there was still that part of me that yearned for it and grabbed onto it for dear life. So it's kind of scary to think that if I hadn't met those people, where would I be today? You know, the in a sense, the luck of bumping into some really amazing people changed my life and allowed me to take a different path. And I think that's why we're talking, because if boys especially, but even men, never hear that there's another way to think about this, it's hard to break out of a trap when you don't know there's an alternative.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's what Jennifer and I, were just recently talking about. It's, she was even just challenging me why, I didn't go down a different side, and I'm like, because I was just so unconscious. I didn't know there was another side until you came.
Yeah.
And just, really quickly, I just want to, compared to you, where you kept that your kind of like your feminine side, with all of these images of how increasingly violent they have gotten and how easily accessible they are. By the time I was in college, to just give our audience a comparison, I was completely dead inside. Like, I had no emotions. I felt numb, and it's still even a work in progress currently to work on my emotional side and get back like that sensitivity that I was talking about in our first video. And that's where, I'm, Jennifer and I are screaming out to, these parents and everyone else of like, this needs to be talked about, because I personally don't want these kids to ever have to, even heal from this. Because it's gotten so intense and it's gotten so horrific, and it just steals young boys' humanity. And this is why, this violence against women and children has just gotten the way that it has.
Yeah. Well, it's a struggle for you still. It's a struggle for me. I don't know any men who confront this honestly, for whom it isn't a lifelong struggle. And maybe in our next conversation, we can talk about what that feels like, why it's worth doing, and suggest some ways people might think about being a man in a different way.
Absolutely.
Great. Look forward to it.
Yes. Thank you, Robert.
Okay.